Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1908, a 14-year-old girl walked into Dr. Samuel Pritchard's office in Charleston, West Virginia, and demonstrated an ability that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ruth Blackwell could tell you the exact moment you would die, not through mysticism or fortune-telling, but through a process so clinical, so precise, that it terrified every medical professional who witnessed it. This is her story, and it's far more disturbing than you might imagine. The year 1908 was a time of rapid change in America. The Wright brothers had proven human flight was possible just 5 years earlier. Henry Ford was revolutionizing transportation with his Model T. Electric lights were replacing gas lamps in major cities. Science seemed poised to explain everything, to illuminate every dark corner of human existence. In this context of rational progress and scientific optimism, Ruth Blackwell's abilities represented something deeply unsettling, a reminder that some phenomena resisted explanation, no matter how advanced our understanding became. West Virginia in 1908 was a study in contrasts. Cities like Charleston and Huntington were experiencing industrial growth, with coal mining bringing wealth and workers to the region. But venture into the mountains, into the remote valleys and hollows of the Appalachian Range, and you would find communities that seemed untouched by modernity, places where old beliefs persisted, where folk remedies competed with modern medicine, where the line between the natural and supernatural remained blurred. Ruth Blackwell was born in February 1894 in a small settlement called Hollow Creek, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, about 40 miles northeast of Charleston. The community consisted of perhaps 30 families, mostly subsistence farmers and hunters, who lived much as their ancestors had for generations. No electricity, no telephone lines, no direct road access. To reach Hollow Creek, you traveled by horse along narrow mountain trails that became impassable in winter. The Blackwell family was unremarkable by local standards. Ruth's father, Jeremiah Blackwell, worked a small farm and supplemented his income by hunting and trapping. Her mother, Sarah, kept house and raised their 4 children. Ruth was the second oldest, with an older brother named Thomas and 2 younger sisters, Martha and Elizabeth. By all accounts, Ruth was a normal child until her 13th birthday in February 1907. According to testimony later given by Sarah Blackwell to investigators, Ruth woke on the morning of her 13th birthday complaining of a severe headache. This was unusual, as Ruth had always been healthy. Sarah gave her daughter willow bark tea, a traditional remedy for pain, but the headache persisted. For 3 days, Ruth remained in bed, barely eating, speaking little, her eyes squeezed shut against light that seemed to cause her physical pain. On the 4th day, the headache vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Ruth emerged from her room, appearing normal, perhaps a bit pale, but otherwise herself. She ate breakfast with the family, helped her mother with morning chores, and seemed completely recovered. It was during the midday meal that the family first noticed something had changed. Ruth's grandfather, Elias Blackwell, was visiting from a neighboring valley. He was 72 years old, in robust health for his age, still chopping his own firewood and walking the mountain trails without difficulty. As the family sat down to eat, Ruth looked at her grandfather and said, quite calmly, "Grandfather Elias will die on November 14th at 4 in the afternoon. His heart will stop while he is sitting in his chair by the fire." The family initially dismissed this as childish morbidity, perhaps influenced by whatever fever had caused her headache. But Ruth insisted she was not guessing or trying to upset anyone. She could simply see it, she explained, the way you might see that rain was coming by looking at the clouds. November 14th at 4 in the afternoon. His heart would stop. He would not suffer. Elias laughed it off. But Sarah Blackwell was disturbed enough to scold Ruth and send her to do chores away from the house. The incident was largely forgotten over the following months. Then November 14th arrived. According to multiple witnesses, including Ruth's father and uncle who were present in the house, Elias Blackwell spent the morning of November 14th in his usual activities. He helped Jeremiah repair a fence, ate lunch with the family, and settled into his favorite chair by the fire after the meal to rest. At approximately 4 in the afternoon, he ceased breathing. No struggle, no cry of pain. He simply stopped, as if a switch had been thrown. The local doctor, summoned from the nearest town 2 days later, when weather permitted travel, concluded that Elias had died of heart failure. Natural causes for a man of his age. The family might have accepted this, might have dismissed Ruth's prediction as terrible coincidence, except for what happened next. In the weeks following her grandfather's death, Ruth began making more predictions. She told her mother that their milk cow would die of a twisted stomach on December 3rd. The cow died on December 3rd. She told her brother Thomas that he would break his left arm falling from a tree on January 7th. He broke his left arm falling from a tree on January 7th. She told her father that a massive snowstorm would strike on February 2nd, trapping the family in their cabin for 6 days. The storm arrived on schedule. Each prediction was specific, detailed, and correct. Not vague prophecies that could be interpreted multiple ways, but precise statements of fact about future events. The family began to fear Ruth, though they tried to hide it. Her younger sisters avoided her. Thomas refused to speak to her. Sarah Blackwell began crossing herself when Ruth entered a room, a Catholic gesture odd in their Protestant household, but one that expressed her growing conviction that something unholy had taken hold of her daughter. Ruth, for her part, seemed distressed by her ability. According to letters she later wrote, she did not seek this knowledge. It simply came to her, unbidden and unwelcome. She described it as seeing 2 timelines simultaneously, the present moment and a specific future moment, superimposed on each other like a double-exposed photograph. She could not control when this second sight appeared, could not choose what future events she witnessed. They simply manifested, clear and unavoidable. The situation reached a crisis point in March 1908, when Ruth predicted the death of her younger sister Martha. She told her mother that Martha would drown in Hollow Creek on April 12th. Sarah, terrified, kept Martha inside the house for the entire day of April 12th. But streams of fate, it seemed, were not so easily diverted. On April 13th, believing the danger had passed, Sarah allowed Martha to go outside to play. The girl wandered to Hollow Creek, lost her footing on a slippery rock, and fell into water swollen by spring rains. She drowned within sight of the house, unable to reach the bank against the current. Ruth had been wrong about the date by 1 day. Whether this represented an imperfection in her ability, or whether her prediction had somehow caused the family to change their behavior in a way that shifted the event by 1 day, no one could say. After Martha's death, the community of Hollow Creek turned against Ruth completely. Whispers spread that she was a witch, that she had cursed her own sister, that the devil spoke through her. The local preacher, Reverend Josiah Stone, came to the Blackwell house and attempted to exorcise what he believed was a demonic presence. The ritual, which involved reading scripture and sprinkling holy water while Ruth was forced to kneel for 3 hours, accomplished nothing except to leave the girl exhausted and more isolated than ever. Jeremiah Blackwell, desperate and afraid, made a decision. He would take Ruth to Charleston, to real doctors, to men of science who might understand what was happening to his daughter. In May 1908, father and daughter made the long journey from Hollow Creek to the state capitol. They traveled by horse to the nearest road, then by wagon to Charleston, arriving after 4 days of difficult travel. Dr. Samuel Pritchard was 53 years old in 1908, a respected physician with a practice on Capitol Street in Charleston. He had studied at Johns Hopkins Medical School, had trained under some of the finest medical minds of his generation, and considered himself a rational man. guided by science rather than superstition. When Jeremiah Blackwell appeared at his office with his daughter and an incredible story, Pritchard's first instinct was to dismiss them both as delusional. But Jeremiah was insistent and desperate and willing to pay. Pritchard agreed to examine Ruth, expecting to find nothing more than a clever charlatan or a mentally disturbed girl suffering from delusions. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. Pritchard's examination notes, preserved in the West Virginia Medical Society archives, provide our most detailed contemporary account of Ruth Blackwell's abilities. The examination took place over 3 days in mid-May 1908. Pritchard brought in 2 colleagues, Dr. Marcus Hammond and Dr. Catherine Merritt, to observe and verify his findings. On the first day, Pritchard conducted a standard physical examination. Ruth was 5 feet 2 inches tall, weighed 98 pounds, slightly underweight for her age, but not alarmingly so. Her vital signs were normal. Her vision and hearing were excellent. Neurological tests revealed no abnormalities. She showed no signs of hysteria, epilepsy, or any other condition that might explain claimed paranormal abilities. On the second day, Pritchard attempted to test Ruth's predictive abilities under controlled conditions. He asked her to predict various trivial events: the weather tomorrow, the number on a rolled die, the contents of a sealed envelope. Ruth explained with remarkable patience for a 14-year-old that her ability did not work that way. She could not summon visions at will, could not answer arbitrary questions about the future. The visions came to her spontaneously, usually when she was in the presence of the person or thing her vision concerned. Pritchard, frustrated but intrigued, asked Ruth if she saw anything about him or his colleagues. Ruth looked at each of the 3 doctors in turn, her young face grave. Then she spoke. Dr. Pritchard will die at age 67 of a stroke while working in his study at home. Dr. Hammond will die at age 49 in a carriage accident on Virginia Street. Dr. Merritt will live to age 81 and die peacefully in her sleep. The specificity was startling, but more startling was Ruth's demeanor. She delivered these predictions with no drama, no theatrical flourishes. She spoke as if reading entries from a ledger, simple facts to be recorded. Pritchard noted that she seemed almost bored by the whole proceeding, as if the knowledge of how and when everyone would die was so commonplace to her that discussing it had become tedious. Pritchard then asked the question that had been bothering him since the examination began. Could Ruth see her own death? The girl was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. She would die at age 16, she said, in Charleston, West Virginia, in a hospital room, of an illness the doctors could not identify or treat. The date would be November 7th, 1910. The time would be 3:22 in the morning. The 3 doctors exchanged glances. This was either an elaborate hoax, a shared delusion, or something that challenged their entire understanding of time, causality, and human consciousness. Pritchard decided to document everything meticulously and wait to see if any of Ruth's predictions came true. He did not have to wait long. On August 3, 1908, Dr. Marcus Hammond was killed in a carriage accident on Virginia Street in Charleston. His horse, spooked by a backfiring automobile, bolted. The carriage overturned and Hammond died instantly from head trauma. He was 49 years old, exactly as Ruth had predicted. Pritchard's notes from the day he learned of Hammond's death reveal a man struggling with the implications. If the girl spoke true about Hammond, then she likely spoke true about me as well. I will die at 67 of a stroke. The knowledge sits in my mind like a stone, heavy and cold. Should I change my habits? Work less? Take holidays? Or are these attempts at intervention futile? If the future is fixed, if it can be seen like a landmark on a distant hill, then what becomes of free will, of choice, of the very concept of trying to change one's fate? Word of Hammond's death and its connection to Ruth's prediction spread through Charleston's medical community. Some doctors dismissed it as coincidence. Others wanted to examine Ruth themselves, to understand this impossible gift. But a third group, larger than Pritchard had anticipated, wanted nothing to do with the girl. They called her unnatural, dangerous, an affront to God and science alike. It was Dr. Catherine Merritt who suggested bringing in specialists from outside Charleston. If Ruth's abilities were genuine, they represented a phenomenon that demanded serious scientific study. Merritt contacted colleagues at Johns Hopkins, at Harvard Medical School, at the University of Pennsylvania. She described Ruth's case in careful clinical language, avoiding sensationalism but making clear the extraordinary nature of what she had witnessed. 3 researchers agreed to come to Charleston to examine Ruth. Dr. William Carson, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins; Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, a psychologist from Harvard who specialized in unusual mental phenomena; and Dr. Thomas Chen, a physicist from the University of Pennsylvania who had published papers on theories of time and causality. The 3 arrived in Charleston in September 1908 and began an intensive study of Ruth that would last nearly 2 months. Their approach was methodical and skeptical. They assumed fraud until proven otherwise, and they designed tests specifically to detect trickery or cold reading techniques that might explain Ruth's apparent abilities. Dr. Carson's neurological examination was even more thorough than Pritchard's had been. He tested Ruth's reflexes, her sensitivity to pain, her visual and auditory processing, her memory, her spatial reasoning. He used the most advanced diagnostic tools available in 1908, including an early electrocardiograph to study her heart's electrical activity and a set of tuning forks to test for neurological damage. He found nothing unusual. Ruth Blackwell was, by every measurable medical standard, a completely normal 14-year-old girl. Dr. Hartley's psychological evaluation was equally exhaustive. She interviewed Ruth for hours, asking about her childhood, her relationships, her dreams, her fears, her beliefs. She administered tests designed to detect various forms of mental illness, from hysteria to schizophrenia to dissociative disorders. She found no evidence of psychological abnormality. Ruth was intelligent, articulate, emotionally appropriate in her responses, and showed no signs of delusion or fantasy. In fact, Hartley noted, Ruth seemed remarkably grounded and realistic for someone claiming such extraordinary abilities. She did not enjoy her gift, did not seek attention for it, and spoke of it with a clinical detachment that suggested she had long ago accepted it as simply part of her reality. Dr. Chen's approach was different. As a physicist, he was interested in the theoretical implications of Ruth's abilities, rather than their medical or psychological basis. If Ruth could genuinely see future events, that suggested either that the future already existed in some fixed form, or that information could somehow flow backward through time, or that human consciousness could access dimensions of reality not normally perceived. Each possibility contradicted fundamental assumptions about how the universe operated. Chen designed a series of tests to determine whether Ruth's predictions were actually glimpses of the future or sophisticated statistical extrapolations based on present conditions. He asked Ruth to predict the outcomes of random processes, coin flips, dice rolls, shuffled cards. Ruth explained again that her ability did not work with random events or arbitrary predictions. She could only see specific future moments connected to specific people or objects in her presence. Frustrated, Chen asked Ruth to predict something about himself, anything that could be verified. Ruth looked at him for a long moment, then said, "You will receive a telegram from your wife 3 days from now, at 9 in the morning. The telegram will say that your father has died. You will take the train to Philadelphia that afternoon." Chen, disturbed by this prediction, nevertheless agreed to document whether it came true. 3 days later, at 9 in the morning, he received a telegram. His father had died suddenly of a heart attack. Chen took the train to Philadelphia that afternoon. When he returned to Charleston 2 weeks later to continue the study, he was a changed man. The casual skepticism was gone, replaced by something approaching fear. The three researchers compiled their findings in a joint report submitted to their respective institutions in November 1908. The report concluded that Ruth Blackwell's abilities were genuine, that she could predict future events with extraordinary accuracy, and that no conventional medical, psychological, or physical explanation could account for her gift. The implications, they wrote, were profound and disturbing. If the future could be seen, if it was in some sense already determined, then fundamental questions about free will, causality, and the nature of time needed to be reconsidered. The report was never published. According to correspondence later discovered in university archives, administrators at all three institutions suppressed the findings. Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Pennsylvania all decided independently that releasing such a report would damage their credibility and open them to ridicule from the wider scientific community. The researchers were instructed to destroy their copies of the report and to cease all investigation of Ruth Blackwell. Dr. Carson complied, though his private letters reveal his frustration. Dr. Chen also complied, but redirected his research toward theoretical physics in ways that would eventually contribute to early quantum mechanics. Dr. Hartley refused. She kept her copy of the report hidden and continued to correspond with Ruth until the girl's death in 1910. Ruth remained in Charleston with her father. They rented rooms in a boarding house on Lee Street, living on money borrowed from Dr. Pritchard. Jeremiah found work in a coal yard, but he was drinking heavily, unable to cope with the burden of his daughter's gift and the loss of his younger daughter. Ruth spent her days alone, reading books borrowed from the public library, avoiding the other residents of the boarding house who had begun to whisper about the strange mountain girl who knew when people would die. It was during this period that Ruth began recording her predictions in a notebook. The notebook, currently held in the West Virginia State Archives under restricted access, contains hundreds of predictions made between October 1908 and October 1910. Most concerned people Ruth encountered in Charleston, complete strangers whose futures she glimpsed in passing. The predictions range from trivial deaths from illness, deaths from accidents, dates of marriages and births, to profound deaths during the Great War that was still years away, deaths during a future pandemic, deaths from events Ruth could not possibly understand given her limited education and experience. One prediction stands out for its specificity and horror. On January 5, 1909, Ruth wrote, "The great ship Titanic will sink in April 1912 after striking ice in the North Atlantic. More than 1,500 people will die. They will know for 2 hours that death is coming, and there will not be enough lifeboats." In 1909, the Titanic had not yet been built. Construction would not begin until March 1909, and the ship would not be launched until May 1911. Ruth, a 14-year-old girl from rural West Virginia with minimal education, somehow knew not only that this ship would sink, but the month and year of its sinking, the cause of the disaster, and details about the inadequate safety provisions that would contribute to the death toll. Dr. Hartley, when she read this prediction in correspondence with Ruth, was shaken. She wrote back asking Ruth to clarify, to provide more details. Ruth responded with a letter dated February 1909. The letter described the Titanic as a massive passenger ship, the largest ever built, which would be promoted as unsinkable. She described its route from Southampton to New York. She described the night of April 14, 1912, the cold Atlantic water, the insufficient lifeboats, the band playing as the ship went down. She described it all with the calm precision that characterized all her predictions, as if she were remembering something she had witnessed rather than forecasting something 3 years in the future. Hartley's letters from this period reveal her growing obsession with Ruth and her abilities. Here was proof, incontrovertible proof, that the girl could see years into the future with perfect accuracy. But that proof was useless. Hartley could not publish the prediction without risking her career, and even if she did, who would believe it? The Titanic had not yet been built. The disaster had not yet occurred. The prediction could not be verified until after the fact, and by then it would be too late to prevent the tragedy Ruth foresaw. This ethical dilemma, whether to act on knowledge of future disasters, tormented Hartley. She wrote to Ruth in March 1909, asking whether there was any point in trying to prevent the things Ruth saw. Could future events be changed, or were they fixed immutably? Ruth's response was chilling. She had tried, she wrote, to change small things. She had warned people about accidents they would suffer, illnesses they would contract. In every case, her warnings either went unheeded or, paradoxically, seemed to contribute to the very outcomes she tried to prevent. Her warning to her mother about Martha's death had led her mother to keep Martha inside on April 12th, which meant Martha was outside on April 13th when she drowned. Her attempts to help seemed only to ensure that fate unfolded exactly as she had foreseen. "I have come to believe," Ruth wrote, "that my visions are not predictions but memories. I am not seeing what might happen, but what has already happened, from the perspective of some point outside of time. The future is as fixed as the past. We experience time as a flowing river, but from outside that flow, all moments exist simultaneously. My gift, if it can be called that, is to perceive time as it truly is, not as we experience it. And if that is true, then all our struggles, all our choices, are merely performances of a script already written." This letter, more than any other document from the case, reveals Ruth's state of mind in the months before her death. She was not merely resigned to her fate. She had developed a philosophical framework to make sense of her ability. Whether this framework was accurate or simply a coping mechanism, we cannot know, but it clearly brought her no comfort. The Ruth who wrote these letters was profoundly lonely, cut off from normal human connection by knowledge no one else could share. In the spring of 1909, Ruth made a prediction that would directly affect Dr. Pritchard. She told him that in October of that year he would be offered a position as chief of surgery at Charleston General Hospital, a position he had coveted for years. He would accept, and the new responsibilities would fundamentally alter his life. Everything Ruth said came true. Pritchard was offered the position in October, accepted it, and found himself suddenly consumed by administrative duties that left him little time for research or private practice. But there was more. Ruth also told Pritchard that he would die at 67 on March 12, 1923, of a massive stroke while working in his study at home. His wife would find him slumped over his desk at 6 in the evening. The knowledge of his own death, Ruth said, would obsess him for the remaining years of his life, would color every decision he made, would rob him of the ability to live fully in the present. She was right. Pritchard's later correspondence is filled with references to his death, with speculation about whether he should try to avoid his study on March 12, 1923, whether he should work less to reduce his stress, whether he should see other doctors to try to prevent the stroke. The knowledge ate at him exactly as Ruth had predicted it would. By late 1909, Ruth's health began to decline. She developed a persistent cough, lost weight, experienced frequent fevers. Dr. Pritchard examined her in November and could find no obvious cause. Tuberculosis was his initial diagnosis, but tests were inconclusive. By January 1910, Ruth was confined to bed in the boarding house, too weak to leave her room. Jeremiah Blackwell, desperate and nearly broke, agreed when Pritchard offered to admit Ruth to Charleston General Hospital for treatment. Ruth was admitted on February 1, 1910. Over the following months, the city's doctors tried everything to diagnose and treat her mysterious illness. They found lesions in her lungs but could not identify the causative agent. They found abnormalities in her blood but could not explain them. She wasted away slowly, her body failing by degrees while her mind remained sharp until the very end. Dr. Hartley came to Charleston in October 1910 to visit Ruth one last time. The girl was skeletal, barely conscious, her breathing labored. But when Hartley sat beside her bed, Ruth opened her eyes and smiled. November 7th, she whispered, 3:22 in the morning. I told you when. Hartley stayed at the hospital for the next 3 weeks, visiting Ruth every day, sitting with her for hours, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes simply holding her hand. Other doctors avoided Ruth's room. They could not treat her, could not save her, and her presence disturbed them. This girl who knew too much, who had seen the future and found it unchangeable, who was dying precisely when and how she had predicted she would die. On the evening of November 6th, Ruth asked Hartley to bring her notebook, the one containing all her predictions. Hartley complied, though hospital regulations technically forbade it. Ruth spent several hours that night writing in the notebook by candlelight, adding final entries, recording things she had seen but not yet documented. When she finished, she gave the notebook to Hartley and made her promise to preserve it, to keep it safe, to ensure that future researchers could study it, even if present ones refused to believe. At 3:22 in the morning on November 7th, 1910, Ruth Blackwell died. She was 16 years old. The official cause of death was listed as progressive wasting disease of unknown origin. In truth, the doctors had no idea what killed her. Her body simply failed, system by system, exactly as she had said it would, exactly when she had said it would. Dr. Hartley kept her promise. She preserved Ruth's notebook, along with all the correspondence they had exchanged, along with copies of the suppressed research report from 1908. She deposited these materials with the West Virginia State Archives in 1941, with instructions that they be sealed for 50 years after her death. Hartley died in 1952, peacefully in her sleep at age 81, exactly as Ruth had predicted. The materials were unsealed in 2002. What do we make of Ruth Blackwell's case today? The notebook exists. The predictions can be verified against historical records. Dr. Hammond's death in 1908, Dr. Hartley's death in 1952, the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, dozens of other events Ruth predicted years before they occurred. All documented, all accurate, all seemingly impossible. Skeptics argue that the notebook must be a forgery, that Hartley fabricated the evidence to support a delusion or hoax. But analysis of the paper, ink, and handwriting confirms the documents are authentic to their purported dates. Others suggest that Ruth's predictions were so numerous and vague that some were bound to come true by chance. But the predictions were not vague. They were specific, detailed, and correct, far beyond what probability could explain. The most disturbing aspect of Ruth's case is not that she could see the future, but what that ability implied about the nature of time itself. If the future already exists in some sense, if it can be observed like a distant landscape, then what does that mean for human agency, for choice, for the possibility that we can change our destinies? Ruth herself came to believe that the future is fixed, that all attempts to alter it are futile or even counterproductive. Her final letter to Dr. Hartley, written the day before her death, expressed this belief clearly. We are not writing our stories. We are reading them. Every choice we make, every action we take, is simply us performing a script already written. My gift was to see the script, and that knowledge has brought me nothing but pain. I would not wish this curse on anyone. When I die tomorrow morning, I will be grateful, not for death itself, but for the end of knowing. Dr. Pritchard died on March 12, 1923, of a massive stroke while working in his study at home. His wife found him slumped over his desk at 6 in the evening. He was 67 years old. In the years before his death, according to his daughter, he spoke often of Ruth Blackwell and the terrible burden of knowing his own fate. He tried to avoid his study on the fateful date, but circumstances conspired to bring him there. A patient emergency required his attention, and he needed documents from his study to treat them properly. Duty brought him to exactly the place where Ruth had foreseen his death, at exactly the time she had specified. The pattern repeated with others Ruth predicted for. They tried to change their fates and found themselves unable. They tried to avoid the places and situations Ruth described and found themselves drawn to them by seemingly inevitable circumstances. It was as if the universe itself conspired to ensure that Ruth's predictions came true, or as if her predictions revealed a future so fixed that even foreknowledge could not alter it. Some of Ruth's predictions remain unverified because the individuals she predicted for disappeared from historical record, or because the events she foresaw have not yet occurred. Among the sealed documents in the West Virginia archives are predictions about events in the 21st century, predictions about wars and disasters and technological developments Ruth could not possibly have understood given her limited education and experience. These predictions remain classified, but researchers who have examined them report being deeply disturbed by their specificity and their implications. What became of Ruth's family? Jeremiah Blackwell returned to Hollow Creek after his daughter's death, a broken man. He died in 1914 of liver failure brought on by years of heavy drinking. Thomas Blackwell, Ruth's older brother, moved west to California and severed all ties with West Virginia. He never spoke of his sister, and his descendants knew nothing of her story until researchers tracked them down in the 1980s. Elizabeth Blackwell, Ruth's surviving younger sister, remained in Hollow Creek her entire life. She married a local farmer, had 6 children, and died in 1972 at age 76. According to her grandchildren, she refused to speak about Ruth, would leave the room if anyone mentioned her sister's name, and seemed haunted by something she never explained. The settlement of Hollow Creek was abandoned in the 1950s when a coal mine opened nearby and the residents relocated for work. Today it's just foundations and overgrown clearings in the woods, accessible only by hiking trails. The Blackwell farm, where Ruth first manifested her abilities, is marked by a collapsed chimney and the remains of a stone foundation. Hikers who visit the area report feeling watched, uneasy, as if the land itself remembers what happened there. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of Ruth Blackwell's case is what it suggests about consciousness, time, and the nature of reality itself. Modern physics tells us that time may not flow the way we experience it, that past, present, and future may all exist simultaneously in a 4-dimensional space-time continuum. If that is true, if time is not a river but a landscape, then perhaps some human minds can perceive that landscape more fully than others. Perhaps Ruth Blackwell was not a prophet or a psychic, but simply someone whose consciousness could access temporal information not normally available to human awareness. This possibility terrifies us because it suggests that free will might be an illusion, that our choices might not matter, that we are indeed simply performing a script already written. But there's another possibility, equally disturbing. Perhaps Ruth was right that the future is fixed, but wrong about why. Perhaps her predictions did not reveal an inevitable future, but rather created one through the power of observation. Quantum mechanics tells us that observation affects outcomes, that the act of measuring a system changes that system. Perhaps Ruth's visions of the future were not passive observations, but active influences, collapsing probability waves into specific outcomes. Perhaps she saw Dr. Hammond dying in a carriage accident, and that vision somehow ensured that he would indeed die that way, even though other outcomes had been possible before she looked. We cannot answer these questions with certainty. Ruth Blackwell's case remains one of the most thoroughly documented examples of apparent precognition in history, but documentation is not explanation. We have the evidence that she could predict the future with extraordinary accuracy. We do not have an understanding of how or why. What we do know is that Ruth Blackwell paid a terrible price for her gift. She lost her sister, her family, her community, her health, and ultimately her life. She spent her final years isolated and misunderstood, knowing things no one else could know, seeing things no one else could see, and finding that knowledge brought nothing but loneliness and despair. If you visit Charleston, West Virginia today, you can see the building that once housed Charleston General Hospital, though it now serves other purposes. Ruth died in a third-floor room on the east side, a room that nurses in subsequent years reported feeling uncomfortable entering, though they could never explain why. The building was renovated in the 1970s, and the old hospital rooms were converted into offices. Workers during the renovation reported unusual occurrences in that particular room. Clocks that stopped at 3:22, unexplained cold spots, a sense of profound sadness that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Dr. Hartley's papers, including Ruth's notebook, are housed in the West Virginia State Archives in Charleston. Access is restricted, requiring written permission and academic credentials. I have examined the notebook personally, and I can attest to its existence and its contents. Ruth's handwriting is clear and steady, her predictions precise and disturbing. Reading her words is like hearing a voice from beyond time itself, a voice that saw what we cannot see and suffered for that vision. The case of Ruth Blackwell asks us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of reality. Questions science still cannot answer. If she truly could see the future, then time is not what we think it is. Free will is not what we believe it to be. And the universe operates according to principles we have yet to understand. Or perhaps Ruth Blackwell was simply a troubled girl whose predictions were coincidences magnified by confirmation bias and the human need to find patterns in chaos. Perhaps the notebook was falsified, the witnesses mistaken, the whole case an elaborate fraud or mass delusion. Perhaps, but sitting in the archives, holding that century-old notebook, reading Ruth's precise descriptions of events that had not yet occurred when she wrote them, I find that explanation hard to accept. The evidence is too strong, too consistent, too thoroughly documented. Something extraordinary happened to Ruth Blackwell between 1907 and 1910. Something that challenges our understanding of time, consciousness, and the very nature of existence. I believe Ruth saw the future. I believe she paid a terrible price for that vision. And I believe that if we could understand how she did it, we would have to fundamentally reconsider everything we think we know about reality itself. The genius girl doctors couldn't study. The girl who knew too much. The girl who saw the future and found it unchangeable. Ruth Blackwell died more than a century ago, but her story continues to haunt those who study it, asking questions we still cannot answer, revealing mysteries we cannot explain. If you found this case as disturbing as I did, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, what time it is where you are, and whether you believe Ruth truly could see the future. Share this story with anyone interested in the mysteries of human consciousness, the nature of time, and the cases that science still cannot explain. Because some stories demand to be told, even if we cannot understand them. Some mysteries persist even when we try to explain them away. And some people, like Ruth Blackwell, remain enigmas a century after their deaths. Their abilities, undeniable and yet impossible. Their stories documented and yet incomprehensible. The past is fixed. We know what happened. But if Ruth was right, if the future is equally fixed, equally knowable to those who can perceive it, then what does that mean for all of us? Are we writing our stories or merely reading them? Do our choices matter? Or are we all performing a script already written? Ruth Blackwell died knowing the answer to those questions. The rest of us can only wonder, and in that wondering, perhaps we begin to understand the terrible burden she carried, the curse of knowing what we are not meant to know, of seeing what we cannot change. Welcome to the mystery of Ruth Blackwell. Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Welcome to a story that will make you question everything you think you know about time, fate, and the nature of human consciousness. This is the story of the genius girl doctors couldn't study, and it's far more terrifying than you ever imagined.